Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank you, Philip, for the really kind introduction. And I also want to thank you all for being here. And I just feel really honored to be in such a beautiful place with you all. And I'm just going to jump right into it because of a limited time. Um, how does this work? Oh, all right. As a person who comes from countries that have been plagued by conflict and destruction, a core part of my artistic practice has been studying preservation and support of cultural heritage from the Middle East that is under threat. And the way I approach this topic is through the use of various historical craft traditions, which is a key element of intangible culture, encompassing knowledge, skills, and traditions that are usually passed down through generations and unfortunately are under threat in the Middle East as well. From my experience as a contemporary artist, I've always had to fight against the public perception that craft is something that is stagnant, no longer important in modern day society, and is a thing of the past, where I personally completely disagree with this idea. Crafts are an embodiment of cultural identity, reflecting beliefs, practices, and values that are being passed down through generations. It's part of our collective history, and ancestral knowledge that at times have been used as a form of resistance. One of my favorite examples of how craft historically was used as an act of resistance is if we take the example of Mahatma Gandhi in India, who promoted and encouraged every household to spin and weave their own cloth. And as a part of the Indian independence movement, it was not just about creating clothes. It was a direct challenge and a way of rejecting the industrialization that was making the local economy dependent on British goods. The suffragettes movement in England is another example of how craft was used as a weapon of change. Between 1908 and 1913, the Artists' Suffrage League embroidered over 150 protest banners to support the women's suffrage movement. These large-scale works of embroidery were used in physical protest to resist patriarchy and assert the rights of women to vote. And in more recent history, craft has been a form of defiance in times when people's ability to create was erased by mass production and industrialization. Unfortunately, in today's society, the art of the handmade is dying out globally, and for very different reasons. One of the most common reasons that I have personally encountered when speaking to craftspeople from the global south is that the younger generation have no interest in learning these skills. They prefer working in other fields that would bring them better livelihoods just due to the lack of interest, patronage, and support for the handmade. Whereas in the global north, craft has slowly become something that is reserved for the rich in society and no longer accessible to the general public. For example, we're seeing this recent trend of slow fashion that promotes the handmade and sustainable approach to making, and its essence is rooted in historical craft traditions, as well as large famous designer houses who adopt the handmade as their ethos of their brand to sell products at a price point that is inaccessible to the general public. However, for the sake of this talk, I'd like to focus on the risks that cultural heritage and craft traditions from the Middle East are currently facing, which has its own host of problems. Wars, conflict, and mass displacement of the human population that inhabit these lands has left the state of cultural heritage severely damaged and the craft traditions nearly extinct. Since the Arab Spring in 2010, which led to many governments toppling in the Middle East and the rise of terrorist organizations such as ISIS in 2013, who took advantage of the ongoing civil war in Syria and disintegrated local military forces in Iraq, cultural heritage across the region faced a heavy price. Over 350 monuments of cultural significance that come from a varied history within the region, dating back to the Neolithic period, such as Palmyra and Syria, but also from a multitude of various civilizations, religions, and cultures that have inhabited the region, have either been heavily damaged or fully destroyed. predominantly by ISIS as a systemic and carefully targeted method of cultural cleansing, but also as a byproduct of conflict between government forces and rebel faction groups. More recently, we can turn to the ongoing bombardment of Gaza and Lebanon by Israel, where they've purposefully destroyed nearly 200 heritage sites of global cultural significance, which reflects a systemic strategy to obliterate the Palestinian identity and is a war crime. As these heritage sites lie in ruins as a byproduct of conflict and terror, there has also been a mass exodus of civilian populations, fleeing to other countries in search of a better future, which also includes the craftsmen and artisans who are the bearers of the knowledge and skill on how to rebuild these damaged heritage sites. If we take the ancient soukas in Damascus, for example, there were nearly over 20 workshops that were dedicated just to the traditional Syrian craft of mother-of-pearl inlay. And now, since the civil war, there's only one workshop left. And unfortunately, when craftsmen are displaced and become refugees or migrants in other countries, they're usually forced into working in menial jobs to help them survive. And nearly always, there's a lack of a network to support them, to help them continue their trade. Even though there are some NGOs that help them and lend support, it's never enough to provide them with a constant stream of livelihood down the line. As a result of this, the depletion of professional craftsmen remaining in conflict zones has severely hampered the future of conservation efforts. The transmutable skills that they hold also ends with them once they leave, because usually with craft traditions in the Middle East, it's something that is an intergenerational knowledge that is passed down from one generation to the other. It's not something you can learn on a course or you learn online. And unfortunately now, because of the current political situation, is nearly becoming extinct. So for me, I would like to kind of share two examples of artworks where I try to tackle these issues and find solutions to the problem in the little way that I can. And as for me personally, when I'm creating an artwork, the process of creating artwork is sometimes more important than the end result or the artwork itself. As I do believe there are ways of thinking about production of art practices that reclaim the handmade and move away from production houses, production factories, and workshops. The question of ethical production is something that I've always been interested in, and exploring how I can personally incorporate that in my practice. The first example I'd like to share is an artwork I made in 2020 titled "When the Dusts of Conflict Settle," which is a project that examines the repercussion of conflict on heritage sites, the communities that are left behind, and how we might approach the challenge of rebuilding what has been destroyed. The artwork draws inspiration specifically from the historical craft of stonemasonry within the Syrian context, whereby I studied and archived the various examples of decorative stone carvings found on monuments across Syria that vary from churches, mosques, citadels, temples, castles as well, that have faced cultural destruction during the Arab Spring. I relied on my training in traditional arts as well, where I learned traditional geometry, by firstly starting to mathematically analyze the various motifs true to their original form, meaning using a compass and a ruler and not using any digital platform to draw a design. Because also a big problem that the conservationists have is the lack of knowledge on even how to redraw traditional motifs by hand instead of relying on digital programs that always leave you with a different result that you can tell there's a lack of harmony. At this time, I was already working on various artworks and projects that document and examine the results of conflict in the region. And I came across a really great organization called the World Monuments Fund, who are an independent global organization that work with local communities around the world to safeguard irreplaceable cultural heritage. One of the initiatives they started was a 6-month stonemasonry program that they set up in Mafraq, which is in Jordan, and it's a small city that borders Syria, and now is home to a large Syrian refugee community who fled the civil war. The training program they started aimed to provide trainees that have both come from Syria and the local community in Jordan with the skills in stonemasonry. So they could either, choose to restore and repair historic monuments in Syria if they choose to go back, but as well strive to provide the students current employment opportunities in Jordan. The reason they've done this from their experience with safeguarding heritage around the world is one of the biggest challenges they faced was the lack of local expertise and craftsmen left in conflict zones. And having experts flown in from abroad to repair the damage and leave is not necessarily a long-term sustainable solution to safeguarding heritage. They need people who are there locally, who live there, and who can safeguard these monuments. So for my project, I personally, this is the artwork, I wanted to work directly with these stonemasons, and the biggest challenge I had was trying to find them. Because after the 6-month course, they moved on, and after a lot of research, I luckily came across another NGO called Turquoise Mountain, who are also based in Jordan, that also work to protect heritage and communities at risk around the world, and they happen to be kind of continuing collaborating with these Syrian stonemasons. But their approach was a bit different. The way they work with artisans is to rebuild sort of craft networks by supporting businesses, linking artisans with designers and architects, and bringing their products to a sort of international buyers, but at an accessible price point. I approached Turquoise Mountain and shared the idea behind my artwork, and thankfully they were happy to collaborate with me as the sort of project managers of sorts. So whereby I received money from the commissioners to do this project, and I used that money to kind of open a temporary workshop, a stone workshop for the stonemasons, and we hired them on full-time, and the Turquoise Mountain kind of acted as the project manager who managed all the logistics, the oversight of the practicalities, the production, and all of that. Even though it was a challenge and logistically much more complicated, this is one of the Syrian stonemasons I worked with. Yeah, it was a much more complicated working process than working with a production house, but I believe it really is totally worth the extra time and effort, because in the smallest way possible, I'm able to contribute to something possible and use the funds I receive from the art world, but to support craft communities. So it's a way to kind of use that money for good. The second example I want to talk about is the artwork I made with Flip. It's an artwork I made in 2021 called Standing by the Ruins of Aleppo, which also engages with the theme of cultural destruction, but through the subject of the Grand Mosque of Aleppo, which you see here. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site and suffered serious damage during the Syrian civil war, including the destruction of its 1,000-year-old minaret during fighting in 2013. And I remember speaking to some locals from Aleppo who told me they remember the day that the minaret of this mosque was destroyed, and it was really traumatic because it was part of the city's skyline. When you look out your window, it's such a predominant feature of the city, and that being erased was extremely traumatic. The artwork was commissioned for the inaugural Dir'iyya Biennial in Saudi Arabia, which Philip curated and kindly supported this crazy idea. And I wanted to create a work that kind of draws parallels between Aleppo's ancient city and Dir'iyya, which are both UNESCO heritage sites and both sites that were shaped by histories of war and violence. The artwork I made was a replica of the mosque's courtyard, which you can see the patterned floor, but built using adobe bricks, because the original was actually made using marble. And adobe bricks is basically clay earth that we sourced from different parts of Saudi Arabia, and also references the kind of traditional vernacular architecture that is used in a Dir'iyya. But instead of following the traditional method of adobe, which uses kind of hay as a binding agent so bricks do not crack, I deliberately left that part out because I wanted the bricks to crack over time. The biggest challenges I faced was, first of all, number one, where to find the local craftsmen with these skills. Number two was, where can I find the sort of blueprints to redraw the original courtyard, which did not exist online. There were no architectural drawings or a plan or a full kind of image of this floor at all. And then number 3 was, where could I get access to a space that was large enough to produce this work, which needed to be made outdoors. And to give you context, the artwork was, the smallest I could possibly make it was 23 meters by 13 meters. So it was a massive artwork that needed a lot of space to produce. The first thing I did was I had to spend a couple of months just redrawing out the geometric floor, and the way I did that was just by gathering as many images that I could find online. I mean, snippets of the floor from different angles, a different kind of zoomed in and zoomed out, and redraw that. And then after redrawing that, I had to design it in a way that it could be translated into modular bricks to be produced in these sort of mud bricks. Secondly was to find the correct artisans, because usually when you're looking for artisans, there's no database online, there's no websites or anything like that. And I really was struggling. So the biannual organization put me in touch with a very specific department in the Ministry of Culture that just focuses on restoring the old mud houses in Adiriyah. And they put me in touch with the head craftsman, who coincidentally turned out to be a Syrian who was from Aleppo. He studied mud architecture, and he's been to this mosque many, many times and knew it very well. So this was the work site. We put a team of approximately 12 craftsmen together, who were all migrants, workers that came predominantly from Afghanistan and Pakistan and had extensive experience in adobe mud architecture. And the Biennale was kind enough to allow us to take over their large parking lot as our production site, which you see here. Most of the staff weren't very happy because this meant they had nowhere to park, but it's okay. And this was for a good 3 months, they had nowhere to park. To make the artwork come to life, we had to produce approximately 13,000 handmade bricks of various sizes and shapes. And we were fully dependent on the sun to make these bricks, as they needed to sunbake approximately for 2 weeks outdoors to fully dry. It's not the same process as ceramics where you fire bricks in an oven. This is, fully kind of connected with nature. And this meant that we were on site before 6 a.m. when the sun was just about to rise, and then we had to stop working at 6 p.m. when the sun set. And the most enjoyable part for me was, and I think was an important aspect of the production process, is that I was thankfully forced to step away from my computer and emails and the studio, and I had to work with the natural elements and outdoors. We were fully dependent on the weather, so we were worried. We'd check the weather every day, because if it rained, it means everything would dissolve. So we would check, and if there was like a 5% chance of rain, we would just cover them up with tarps. And I felt that this approach to working with nature rather than against it is something that is integral to a lot of historical craft traditions that we have lost the connection with. And this is the artwork, the end result. I do think it's also important to mention that another common struggle I have when I come across multiple projects as well is convincing craftsmen to work in a method that is sometimes contradictory to what they're used to. Because with craft, you're working with a tradition that has been around for centuries and has been done a specific way for centuries. And when you innovate with that, sometimes they can be uncomfortable with it. And specifically in this context is, adobe bricks is, first of all, not including the hay, and allowing the bricks to crack seemed counterproductive to them. And secondly, the craft as well is nearly always used to build structures, so, upwards. It's never been used as a way to cover floors. You're not meant to walk on them or anything like that. But time and time again, I always kind of have this positive kind of experience is once whatever the work we do is completed, I do see the shift in their mindset of the artisans in a sense. And a sense of pride is there, that they also get to see their work displayed in a different context. It's not used in a functional manner like most traditional crafts are, but it's shown in an exhibition setting. And I always find it ethically very important to add all of the craftsmen I work with as collaborators and invite them to the openings and be there to share kind of in that moment. And I find this approach to historical crafts is something that is important in certain contexts. Crafts shouldn't be stagnant, but there are ways of innovating with traditional knowledge and adopting it to the contemporary that can make it relevant to today and not a thing of the past. Thank you.